You're listening to Science and Saucery, a show dedicated to exploring innovative minds and adding life to your years. And now, your host, scientist Rick Cronise.
Welcome. I hope you're having a great day. Today is going to be a very fun day for me, and I'm glad you're here to enjoy this conversation. It's an example of why I love what I do. For the last 30 years, I've been fortunate to work with some leading experts in a wide range of fields. And from time to time, my science career has intersected with truly innovative minds. And today, you're going to hear a conversation with one of those people. You may not have heard of him before, but his work is critical. Dr. Gary Beauchamp is considered one of the world's leading experts on chemosensory science. He studied biology in undergraduate and has a PhD in biopsychology, and it's a really interesting combination of taking that underpinnings of biology and combining it with the psychology of why we do it. If you remember Ali Bousari's interview when we talk about the difference with taste and flavor, which we'll also get into today, is this idea that what we think about something actually changes how we perceive it. But he's worked with the Monell Center, which is the world's only nonprofit interdisciplinary research organization dedicated to taste and smell, for 50 years. So he knows what has happened over the last half century. He's currently the Emeritus Director and the President of the Monell Chemical Senses Center. But he's served as a scientific advisor to numerous government and private organizations, the National Science Foundation, NSF, the National Institutes of Health, NIH, and the Institutes of Medicine, IOM. They put out the dietary guides. But I find his work with the comparative biology on taste and smell perception is just completely fascinating. From sweet to umami to spicy, his research has been critical in us beginning to untangle the really complex ways we perceive the world and decide what to eat. So this conversation might get a little technical, but it's overall a subject we all have some kind of expertise in. We all eat. And what I hope we'll be able to discuss today is more about how and why we like certain foods, tastes, and flavors. So with that intro, Gary, welcome to Science and Saucery. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm really excited about talking to you on this subject.
It's good to be here. I'm looking forward to talking to you.
Yeah. So I've got this great first experience. It's morning when we're recording this, and I have before me 2 cups of coffee. Actually, I have a cup of coffee and an espresso. So I'll tell you a weird thing about me and flavor and taste. For some reason, I developed early on the idea of, even in tea with my grandmother, cream and sugar in tea, and later in coffee, and I developed a love for sweet, creamy coffee. So my friends would often joke, are you going to have coffee with that milk? I no longer have dairy. I'm all plant-based, but I still like cream in my coffee. And I tried to develop a like for black coffee. And I've tried it, and it's just never worked. Yet, I also have a piping hot, steaming espresso in front of me. And I love espresso. And so I'm going to take a sip real quick. You know, first it's the smell, because that's the first thing I've had today. I didn't have anything flavor-wise, and that smell and seeing the crema that's on the top, I have an espresso machine. It makes a really good espresso, and it's bitter, but I love that bitter. Mm-hmm. And yet now I'm going to take a sip of this other one. And this one has a caramel creamer. It's the most unhealthy thing a person could probably put in coffee. It's a silk creamer, and it's full of sugar and other stuff. And that's really good too. But why is it that I've created this situation where black coffee, I can't seem to to find joy in a cup of black coffee. Yet I love how it smells, and I love the bitter of this espresso. What do you think goes on there? How do we perceive these things?
Yeah, what you're doing is you're setting me up to tell you that I don't know the answer to that question.
But that's good. But tell me about the difference between taste and flavor, because in one of those things, in both of them, I'm having a similar experience.
Yeah, right. So actually, let me take an example, fairly recent study that was done, which I think really illustrates the kinds of things you're talking about. And so this was a study by some anthropologists up in the Bering Straits, and they were studying the diets of the traditional people that lived there. And it's a very complicated story because it's part in the U.S. and part in Russia across the Bering Strait. Same people, but obviously under different rules. And there was a political twist to it as well. But the main thing was that the people that lived up there, traditionally, their diet, their main source of protein and perhaps many other nutrients came from the following kind of recipe. They would take a moose, take out its stomach, and into its stomach they would put pieces of the moose, fish, and maybe some other things, but mainly those two things. And then they'd put it out in the permafrost and essentially let it rot. And it would rot for maybe 6 months. And then they would dig it up and they would eat it. And this was sort of the traditional diet, probably for thousands of years, or who knows how long. And the anthropologists went up there to study this. Of course, as anthropologists do, their idea was that they would have to sort of be part of the meal themselves. And what they report in their paper is that they could not get this food down. I mean, they just literally, it smelled so terrible. Mm-hmm. And to them tasted, and we'll get back to what that might have meant, so terrible that they were nauseated and would throw up.
Yeah, putrescine, 1,4-diamino butane, I believe, is the compound for that.
Well, there's actually quite a few compounds.
But it's one that most people very much object to. But what you're saying, they acquired an experience that was pleasurable, and it would be very difficult for a person just coming into that to have anything but a normal gag or disgusting reflex.
Yes, exactly. And presumably their exposure to it, particularly early in life, seemed to be important. And that's where the politics came in, because what these anthropologists studied was that when Russia began to move in, the Soviet Union began to move into the Russian, the Asian part of this, they prohibited these people from eating their traditional diet. I think literally prohibited it, and fed them food that was shipped in cans. And so a generation was raised on this other sort of what we would call semi-normal food. And then when the Soviet Union collapsed, they were no longer shipping food in, and so these people had to go back to the traditional diet. But the older people went back to it just fine because they had been exposed to it early in life, and in fact they craved it, and it was wonderful. But the people who grew up with the Russian foods, they really had a hard time with it. It wasn't, even though they knew they should, even though they saw their parents consuming it, none of this worked, because there was something about this early imprinting that went on, which I think is probably mainly the smell, which caused them to find it overwhelmingly bad. And one idea I have, and this is just a guess, is that these kinds of odors, putrescine, as you said, and a number of others, are a consequence of rotting. And so it may be that humans are sort of built to really be very suspicious of those smells. But if they're raised with them early in life, if their parents are eating them, obviously they're not poison. Mm-hmm. And I think we humans have enough variability to be able to learn to like things like that.
Right. Yeah, and one of the things that's interesting on this, because what I do is help people with lifestyle transformation, and then because of what I did myself, which moved from a omnivorous diet to a whole food plant-based diet because I was trying to deal with specific issues, diabetes, etc. What I found is until the new diet is equally convenient, familiar, and enjoyable, you really don't have a choice. One or more of those will dominate the plate. And it takes a while, but some of these habits there seems to be some neuroplasticity such that later in life you can. What I think about this one is that a lot of people have tried to accommodate it later, and it just becomes a really difficult thing. And I think people often have foods that they strongly dislike, and it's really hard for them to get over that aversion. If you don't like the feel or the sound or the taste of a mushroom, for example, these things really can be strong, powerful motivators.
Absolutely. And if you think, particularly if, and this is one of my bugaboos, that the early experience is particularly important, and think of how food and caring and touching and whatever that goes on early in life, those are so reinforcing. And so you've got this powerful reinforcement from the mother. We know that these flavors are transmitted through amniotic fluid in human milk, and so there's this incredible time when it becomes not easy to learn. It's a little bit like language, but even, in my view, more profound, as you know, or at least for me it is, because I know one language vaguely, which is English, and I have had so much trouble trying to learn other languages, and wish, that I had the experience early in life, which my wife did because she grew up early in life in Japan, of learning another language, because our brains just seem to be ready to bring in and accept this. And there's some great examples of this in birdsong, where birds learn the song of their parent, but they can only learn it during this early stage. Now, food, as you're implying, and is true, is you can learn to like things you didn't like. There's no doubt about that. And alcoholic beverages are a great example of that. But there, and with coffee as well, you've got a powerful reinforcement. You've got alcohol in one side, and caffeine is a reinforcing item. So, in my view, there are very, very few people that truly like bitter things.
So, one thing that's kind of interesting, and this is completely off the subject of taste, but it's something I just happened to have read about a few days ago. It just came across my searches. But in Cell Metabolism back in January, there was an article that talked about macrophages requiring putrescine which is why I knew the stuff off the top of my head, to actually consume the cells going through apoptosis, that these macrophages need this supply of putrescine to sort of upregulate them so that they can break down these cells. And it's really interesting how so many things that we see in diet and other places, that there are these other kinds of connections. I see a lot of connections when I first heard your talk and studied your work between the evolutionary biology side of what you would describe as a lizard brain kind of approach, like how a neonate responds to flavor and taste versus an adult, and me seeing what people have evolved to do socially, which you are describing right here, where they've actually acquired a liking, like in the case of what's in front of me, bitter versus sweet. But both of them have a lot of underpinnings, a lot of social underpinnings, and as you're now saying as well, which I hadn't thought about, as the reinforcement of the caffeine, or in the case of alcohol. So let's talk a little bit about what's the difference between taste and flavor.
Okay, yeah. So this is sometimes could be a pedantic discussion, particularly from a scientist. But
right.
The word taste is a confusing word, and it's confusing not only in the English language, but it's in other languages as well, because in common parlance, it refers really to the experience you have with food, maybe even at a distance, but certainly when you put it in your mouth, the sensory properties that accrue for that. And the sensory inputs for that are actually multisensory. There are several senses. The two most common ones are what we will call taste, per se, which I'll get back to in a moment. And then there's the sense of smell. And the sense of smell in foods, particularly when it's in the mouth, is the odor molecules, which are small molecules, come floating in the air, and they come back through the back of the throat, and they come up into your nose, which is right between your eyes. The receptors are right between your eyes. And so when you're getting the flavor, the smell, when you're eating strawberries, for example, you get a strawberry smell, strawberry flavor, that smell is actually up, being received up in the top of your head, but it's referred to your mouth because this is something that is in your mouth. And the anatomy is complex there, but basically our experience then is with taste in the more generic sense is really things that are smelled, things that are tasted, and the taste receptors for conscious taste are in the tongue and the palate and the throat. And there's a third sense that is also very interesting, which is the sense of irritation, burning, tickling, what have you, which is another puzzling one because it seems to be evolutionarily tied to the fact that it's a plant warning system telling you this might be dangerous, and yet half the world, or maybe most of the world, chooses to have at least low levels of hot peppers, carbonation, what have you.
Right.
That's kind of restricted to human beings as well. There's an argument about that, but it's not common for other animals to search that out, but humans clearly do. So the taste system, if we want to talk about taste in the pure sense, is really this sense of detection of nutrients or poisons, and so the receptors are, as I said, in the tongue, in the palate, a little bit in the throat, perhaps, and these respond to really, really, really important things in the environment. And if you look across many, many, many species, they're all about the same. They're responding to calories, and the receptor, the percept for that is sweetness, and so sweet is good. And under almost all circumstances, the sweeter the better, because that's signaling that this plant it has calories, and it presumably is not poison. And its pair, and Aristotle thought of these as the two most fundamental of taste, sweet and its companion bitter, kind of yin and yang. The bitter is the other side of the coin, and most bitter substances that we are exposed to again come from plants, and presumably the plants are producing them, at least in part, as a defense to try to keep the plant from being eaten by some other animal. It's not humans. It's probably aimed at the insects or other animals that eat the plants. But we all seem to be able to respond to a wide array of these compounds with these bitter taste receptors. And it turns out there's about 25 in humans. And there's many of these receptors because there's so many different classes of bitter compounds. And for the most part, it's pretty clear that these are innately bad. So you've got this yin-yang of sweet and bitter. Then along with that, there's saltiness, which is sodium is an absolute requirement for life, of course, and particularly amongst animals that are omnivorous or herbivorous. Sodium is actually hard to find. And so we seem to be built, as do many other species that are omnivorous and herbivorous, with a detection system that detects saltiness from sodium, which is the necessary mineral, and responds generally positively to that. So the fourth sort of classic basic taste, and this goes back thousands of years, and into China, into India, all came up with the same classes of basic tastes that is sour. And sour has always been a big puzzle to me. I don't know what it's doing there. Some people say it's protecting against consuming fruit too early. I don't know about that. It's a puzzle. And then there's this most recent one, which has been talked about much in the past 20, 30 years, which is the umami taste, which is identified by the Japanese, who worked most closely with it, as sort of the parallel to sweet taste. So sweet taste is aimed at carbohydrates. Supposedly, umami taste is aimed at protein or amino acids. Again, there you find in many species this ability to detect specific amino acids and to respond to them positively, and drives to some degree probably our liking for meats, which is again, I think probably a fairly strong kind of built-in process, but one which can be modified, and it's obviously not required. But one of the interesting things about the umami part is that this is a much more subtle taste, and the fact that it was identified in Japan is not the slightest bit surprising, because their diet was very low in animal protein. And even in fish, and very high, of course, in rice and things of that sort. And so they would make their early diets and developed a cuisine which used seaweed and some fish, and made these soups that were almost primarily glutamate, which is the umami taste, and so they were very attentive to that, and we consume many things that have glutamate in it. Glutamate's the most common amino acid in edible protein, and it's common in plants as well. And it seems to signal the presence of something that we again absolutely need. We've got to have protein, and it turns out to be highly, highly attractive. But it doesn't have the salience of the sweet, sour, salty, and bitter.
Right.
And the taste system, so we know those are the basic tastes.
Before we leave that, couple of notes that I just would love to drop as an underscore with this, and that is, one, coming back to the sort of the sweet-bitter dichotomy, the poison versus calorie thing, which I think is, well, as much as we can hypothesize, we probably can't prove it, but at the same time, there's a lot of evidence in that direction. The real fun thing is, like, when we look at, for example, sulforaphane, which is formed in a cruciferous vegetable when you rupture the cells, and the myrosinase acts with the glucoraphanin to form that compound, that sulfurous compound that has that bite that you get with mustard greens or some of those things. And that does make sense, what you were talking about, the animal maybe not wanting that. It's almost a spicy flavor. I picked that example because there is a bitter element to it, but there's also a spicy element to it that we would recognize, and yet we tend to like broccoli sprouts or mustard greens because they have that. And clearly that might be a defense. And it then turns out, getting to longevity and health span research, that sulforaphane is a very potent anti-cancer compound. I mean, if it wasn't so widely available in nature and could have been patented in some way, my guess is it would be a lot more prevalent in treatment of certain cancers, because it certainly has a role there. And so anyway, I wanted to say that as an underscore, because I think it puts together some of the elements that you're putting down in terms of why we might have evolutionarily worked one way. And then the one that eventually I would love to write a paper about at some point with you, which is, and how this would be framework, but the idea of us sensing those amino acids. And I find it interesting, first, the concept of when you talked about how common glutamate is, especially given the scare that the dreaded 3 letters MSG puts in the fear of everybody. But the glutamate part of that, the anion part of that molecule, is the most common free amino acid in breast milk. I know we'll talk about that in more detail in a minute, but the point here is that all of the essential amino acids, the ones we actually need in diet, and one of the things my audience knows is I don't use protein, carbs, and fat because they group non-metabolically similar compounds. In other words, there's not enough granularity. You and I know what we mean when we say them, but the average person, they're marketing terms for food. And so I try to get them to forget those. But what is significant here is that the essential amino acids, interestingly, are all bitter.
Absolutely.
Arginine, histidine, isoleucine, leucine, lysine, methionine, valine. I mean, these are bitter ones, and the ones that are sweet, alanine, glycine, whatever, we make those we don't need to sense those. And that's what makes this really interesting thing with aspartate and glutamate is when we look at those from an umami perspective, these become this other kind of perception. So it is sensing the presence of amino acids, but it's interesting that it's so strong. And while most of the people listening have never done the taste test where you take bland vegetable broth and then you just put MSG in it, monosodium glutamate, and you taste that, and then you put the MSG plus, which is the monosodium glutamate plus the inosinate plus the guanylate, which are ribonucleotides, and we can all get it back into this later. I'm sure Gary will talk a little bit more about this, but these are synergistic ribonucleotides, which also really have profound effect on flavor. It tastes more like carrots. It tastes more like celery. It tastes more like vegetable broth. It doesn't add this extra flavor. Whereas if I try to say, and this is why the importance of Japanese culture and Japanese food to discovering this, if I tell someone in the Western world sweet, they know what sweet is because they've tasted sugar. But if I talk about umami, they really don't know what it is, because if I say, well, it tastes like a banana, well, banana tastes like something different. An apple, it tastes like apple. If you haven't had pure sugar, you really don't know this sweet. And umami is even more evasive than that because it seems to enhance other flavors in an interesting way. Can you talk a little bit about this? Because I think it's a place where it's interesting because the off-ramp here is it's not a pure kind of flavor like that, but also that even when we talk about umami as sensing amino acids, the ones we actually need are bitter, and most counts of bitter is that that's something we wouldn't want to eat. So to me, there seems to be a interesting dichotomy there that isn't accidental.
Yeah, well, you raised about 8 difficult and important questions.
Good, let's talk through them.
So let me see which one to go to first.
All right.
First off, again, for the general public, you're completely right that people don't have a exemplar for umami like we do for sugar, or even one like we do for bitter, which we could take as, say, quinine water or coffee with your nose held closed or something like that.
Sour, we have sour everywhere.
Sour is so clear.
Have salty?
Salty, no problem. Right. And that's why I believe that, again, this was sort of a fun thing to do, is to read back into the both the traditional medical literature, but also into the literature of taste and basic taste that goes back several thousand years in the writings in China and in India. And they all come up with this sweet, sour, salty, bitter as these are the primary things. And basically, everybody knows them. Bitter things are used for medicinal purposes, and it's very, very clear. But umami, not so clear. And it turns out that the closest thing we have to, if you really wanted to know what pure umami was, is to take the product Accent, which is MSG, and I think it's still sold in stores, and put it into water. And if you do that and taste it, I'm almost guarantee you will not like it.
Right.
It's kind awful. It's kind of awful. It has a little bit. It has a little saltiness to it because the M in MSG is sodium, monosodium.
Right.
And so if you have another ion there, say potassium, it'll be a little bit bitter because potassium is a little bit bitter. But the glutamate part is not inherently pleasant. And I actually years and years ago did not believe this. We were working I was working in Mexico at the time on taste in malnourished infants, and what I found was that these infants, if given a bland soup, were not particularly interested in it. But if you put MSG into it, they loved it. That's a little extreme, but there was a big difference. And so what my guess was that there was some sort of inherent liking for MSG very early in life, but then people learned that it went along with food. But I don't think that's true. I think it just by itself is not attractive, at least in humans. But what it does in foods, and I don't think we know exactly how this works, is it makes many of them much, much better. And you use some examples of making it like celery or things like that. What I think is one of the most profound effects of MSG, which really has not been emphasized all that much, is that it gives a tactile feeling to it.
Right.
There's almost as if it makes it seem more like food, because there's a substance to it, a mouthfeel, which does not occur if you just have say pure salt water or even fairly low sugar water. You don't get this mouthfeel, but here you have a feeling of fullness. And so I think umami is a really complex thing where it's not just a taste, or not just a taste as we think of taste, but is a much broader kind of flavor. And that's the reason I think people think of it as a flavor enhancer, because it has these other attributes that are highly attractive. And exactly how that works, I mean, that's been something that I've pondered a long time, and I have colleagues studying it, and maybe we'll make some progress on understanding maybe there are specific receptors for glutamate that are not just taste receptors or on taste cells, but are signaling something else about this. Now, the other issue about this is, and again, you point out a really bizarre thing. Why in the world should we have this strong response to an amino acid, which is really, really common, and which we don't need, that we can make?
This is the evidence for those of people out there listening that still believe MSG gives you headaches and it's poison. I'm just going to tell you, like, if you're allergic to MSG or sensitive, you're probably sensitive to your own blood plasma or your mother's breast milk. I mean, nobody thinks that breastfeeding is simply calories. And the idea that neonates respond to this umami flavor and they respond to sweetness immediately, and that the free amino acid glutamine, which becomes that anion that he was talking about in the salt, the bottom line is that amino acid is the most common free amino acid in breast milk. I mean, by the smallest concentration of amino acid, it's like 400 times more concentrated. It's incredible. And I find, again, this is the part that finds it puzzling, because as you were talking earlier about and I'm just going to call it putrescine, but needing to be exposed to this early because it's so repulsive, I just wonder if part of this comes back to breastfeeding. Have they ever looked at responses of, for example, adults later in life that were breastfed versus not breastfed? Or I guess maybe even breast milk, maybe even synthetic breast milk can have free glutamate in it. So that wouldn't even be a good study. But it's just puzzling that the ones we need are bitter.
Yeah, it is. And so one possible explanation for it, but it's certainly not scientifically proven, is that what it does is serves as a signal. And if it's there, then probably there are other amino acids there as well. So you can argue there's no sense in particularly having an ability to detect each one of these amino acids that we need, if in fact there's a marker for it in the more common one. And people have made this argument actually for salt, that saltiness, we need sodium. There's no question about that, so it's different in that regard. But most sources of salt throughout evolutionary history have been associated with other minerals as well. And we obviously need other minerals, generally speaking, at low levels. And they are in many sources of salt, in plants and in the ground and digging up earths and things of that sort. And so maybe the saltiness taste is there not just to detect the sodium, but to ensure consumption of other minerals. And you can kind of think that during human use of this, we started to be able to separate the signal, which is the nutrient sodium, from maybe what it was actually signaling or is signaling in the real world. And if you give people salt water, in our culture at least, salt water to drink, they don't like it. But it turns out babies do, but adults certainly don't. But it turns out if you take that same level of salt water and you warm it up a little bit, put a little food coloring into it, put it into a bowl, and give it to people, then it's not so bad. And if you add a little MSG to it, it's a great bouillon. And there you've got almost nothing, no new chemicals. A few, you've got these two things that are the saltiness and what I think is the mouthfeel, which is so important. And you've got expectations, and you've got past experience, and so you can create something that is simple and yet highly attractive. And I think I do have to go now, but going back to I eat meat, so I'm not in your. But I think you're probably right. I haven't made it yet. But the very best meals I've ever had are in Buddhist monasteries, which are all completely plant-based and are absolutely wonderful.
Amazing, right?
One can almost extend this argument to sweet even. Sweet things are sweet, and we like them, and they signal to some degree the presence of sugars which provide calories, but they're also associated with other things, particularly vitamins and minerals. And so things that an animal would eat, and human ate when they were mainly herbivorous, pre-humans, that they would be getting other nutrients. And it's a little bit like what some of the nutritionists, the arguments they make that that sugar is empty calories. Well, it didn't have to be. Sweetness doesn't have to be empty calories.
No. Yeah, sweet is not sugar, and you're exactly right. And I'll take this one step further, because the work that I've done with David Sinclair in dietary restriction without malnutrition, our metabolic winter hypothesis. This is the idea that times of mild cold stress or times of dietary restriction upregulate certain things all the way down to the mitochondrial level, which we know in organisms from yeast to primates mean extra life. And so when we restrict without being malnourished, so dietary restriction without malnourished, by definition, that 30% restriction is superfluous calorie, superfluous nutrition, because they don't decline, they live longer, right? So it has to be superfluous. So there is an excess probably built in because nutrition is sporadic in the real world. But in the modern world of chronic overnutrition, we have all these dietitians running around trying to say we need to get enough, and yet we've never really extended life by giving organisms more. And so this makes a really good argument to what you're saying right now. I think it's a good evidence, or at least a good correlation with it, because in nature, think about weight loss the way you would hear about it in a popular way, the normal medical world. They restrict calories, but they give them goop that has full complements of nutrition. If it's true that in nature, our bodies signal during times of nutrient restriction, and they upregulate the survival genes, the sirtuin genes, or upregulate the utilization of certain nutrients and the conservation of other nutrients in our body, under what evolutionary paths could we actually have reduced calorie and full nutrition? And maybe our problem with obesity today is the fact that we give everybody all the nutrition and just restrict the calories, sending all of these signals that you're talking about. We're talking about subtle signaling on amino acids, subtle signaling on sweet, subtle signaling on minerals. And what happens when people are chronically overnourished, not just with the nutrient side, but with hyperpalatability, and then they're told, reduce your calorie? How would we as an organism ever adapt to overnutrition? And it seems like with the world getting bigger and bigger and bigger, we don't have those coping mechanisms. Does that make sense, how that fits into what you're saying about these sensing as being almost proxies for other things, and yet we are in a world of excess all the time?
Yeah, I mean, it does, and one has to, or at least I have to admit that this is speculation.
Sure.
But you're referring to a lot of the studies that suggested that reducing body weight extends life, and I think that there's strong evidence that that's true. Maybe even in primates. I don't know whether it's true in humans or not. I don't think we can do a real careful experimental study on that. But the idea that we evolved in a situation where, you know, the most important thing that we had to do was to find enough food with appropriate nutrients to live, and I always make the argument that the most dangerous thing that an animal did in even up to several million years ago was to decide whether or not to put this thing in your mouth and to swallow it, because it could be really dangerous.
Absolutely,
it could be absolutely necessary, and so this is and one can easily make the argument that in terms of survival and therefore reproduction and passing on your genes to the next generation or whatever, is that the animals that were most able to identify these foods and to prefer them would be very, very successful. And it turns out that if some of these things, maybe in the long run were not so good for you, caused cancer, for example, or caused obesity, although I don't think that was probably ever an issue until recently. Mm-hmm. Who cares? Evolution doesn't care about that.
It's done with you by 45 or 50. The chronic diseases we're all fighting happen after reproductive prime.
Yeah, it was probably done by the time you were 30 or 25 even. And so there's this strong push for overnutrition, so-called overnutrition. The paying attention to that and thinking about that, I think, really leads to people being much more pay much more attention to what they're eating and what they're choosing, and being more sensitive to it. And that's why I kind of still fall back on what used to be the Japanese diet of very broad amount of different foods, small amounts, flavored with delicately, but with foods and flavors that made them attractive, but not overwhelmed. And obviously in our culture that just we've this is not a new insight by any stretch of the imagination, but we've decoupled the nutrient value with the driving sensory value.
Yes.
And the consequence, the consequences are all around us. So, how to deal with that, how to get out of that conundrum, that is still a problem that I haven't been able to solve. That's for sure.
No, it's very complicated, but it's fun to think about. And what's really interesting is, as you were talking about handing down why it was so dangerous in the real world to be putting things in your mouth, the idea that handing this down as a tradition, and the fact that we have that neuroplasticity at an earlier age that can take this up and really create a very fundamental memory, reflecting back on this putrescine or whatever that meal was from the Inuit that they were eating that was so horrible. This is sort of a reinforcement in some sense. I know it's speculation as well, but it's a reinforcement of this idea, because under any normal circumstances, you would not put that in your mouth. In fact, your body would reject it violently. And so there are obviously these kinds of, in a real world where you don't have labels and the FDA and all this other thing, and you're out there wandering around thinking about what to pick up and food is scarce, this idea of handing that tradition down would also be an evolutionary advantage, where appetite, it's not a trait of negative selection in a calorie-scarce world.
Right, yes.
Right?
Exactly. And funny story about that. To sort of illustrate that in a column I wrote years and years ago, I said, I recommended to people, this is where the error was, I recommended to people to go out into the woods and just pick things off the tree, leaves, berries, what have you, and put them in your mouth and chew them up. And you'll find that almost everything out there is bitter. Everything is very unpleasant. And that's because there's this constant war between the plant, which doesn't necessarily want to be eaten, at least until the fruit is ready, and the animal, which necessarily needs to get nutrients. And I got a letter back from a colleague in the veterinary school here at Penn, chastising me, and I think maybe in retrospect rightfully, for suggesting people do anything like that because they might kill themselves.
And that's your point.
But you shouldn't do it. But it's the truth.
It is the truth. And it was so difficult to find food. And now we're in this world of not just finding food, but it has to be hyper palatable. We've got to have the kinds of tastes and flavors that include the experience, includes the restaurant ambiance. And what I hear when you're talking is that really what most of the vices or problems we perceive are our evolutionary advantages gone awry. And they're better explained by cultural and social norms outpacing genetics.
Yes, absolutely true.
You know, it's just crazy that it is so complex. So there's so much we don't understand.
So one of the things, and I just go back to a little bit earlier conversation. So if you think of these taste qualities that are really fundamental: sweet, sour, salty, bitter, maybe umami, and it's really, you can make a great story about it, but what is the evidence for it? And to me, the best evidence for all of these kinds of things are I'm a comparative biologist, among other things, but are looking at other animals. And one of the most fun things I ever did was years and years ago, I was interested in how cats detect food, for reasons I won't go into. But what we discovered was, it seems obvious now, but we discovered that cats had no interest whatsoever in anything we called sweet. And we went over to the Philadelphia Zoo and tested lions and tigers and leopards and jaguars, and they too were totally uninterested in that. But amino acid mixtures or fat mixtures, they loved those. And so we postulated that a long time ago then that perhaps cats really can't taste sweet. And it wasn't until the molecular revolution of around 2000 for taste, when a sweet receptor was identified, that we were able to show that the cat really has lost its ability to taste sweet. It still has the genes for a sweet receptor, but they're broken essentially. They've developed mutations, and it turns out that many animals that eat only meat don't taste sweet. And this makes perfect sense, but it also really reinforces the idea that this sensory attribute, sweetness, is one to detect sugars in plants. And obviously, animals that don't eat plants, why would they bother? And there's a great study that it hasn't really been replicated all that much, so I don't know how widespread it is. But looking at in the exact reverse, when birds and reptiles split off, however many million years ago that was, the birds actually lost part of the sweet receptor. It for whatever reason, we don't know, it is not found typically in birds, and particularly the birds that have been studied are chickens and things like that. They don't have a sweet receptor, and presumably they don't seem to taste sweet. But we kind of know intuitively that there must be some birds that taste sweet, like hummingbirds, because they obviously go after sweet things. Now, they could use some other signal. Who knows? But this study done by a woman at Harvard showed that what the bird has done, or what the hummingbird has done at least, is to repurpose the amino acid, the umami receptor, into a sweet receptor. So it's somehow, and who knows how that would work, because it's creating a new function. But that opened up for these birds a whole new ecosystem where they could get food that other birds and presumably could not. And so this kind of evidence is really pretty strong that sweetness has played this very, very important role throughout millennia, many millennia of biology, and I think that the typical wild animal that is an omnivore basically is spending its time making a judgment when it puts something in its mouth, sort of like the relative amounts of danger versus benefit, sweet versus bitter, and going back to Aristotle's idea that this is the yin and the yang, and obviously it's very complex in there, and we can learn to like bitter things, but usually it's because we've had some strong reinforcement, and often it's done under ways where we even there minimize the bitterness by adding, as you do, cream to your coffee and sugar. So I think that humans really have had this ability or to modify what they like based on their prior experience, because there's been this availability of all these other things, and because then of our technical ability to separate the stimulus, the thing that's attractive, the sweetness or the saltiness, from the thing that it was normally associated with, which was obviously many other really valuable things for the human body or for the animal body.
Yeah, and it's really fascinating. I remember in watching your presentation when you went through T1R3 and T1R1, and can you talk a little bit about, at the molecular level, how we start to sense, and how you can actually look at various animals and understand what those flavors or what those receptors are? Because we know a lot more in the last 2 decades about these actual functional sites.
Right, and there's that's definitely true. So for actually my institution, which is the Monell Chemical Senses Center, probably was set up, at least amongst some of the people that created it, with the holy grail being, what is sweet? How do we detect sweet? And this was before the molecular biology revolution, so we were doing biochemistry and trying to take tongues and grinding them up and seeing if we could find what receptor it was. Not very successful. But around 2000, we and actually 6 other groups simultaneously identified essentially 2 genes producing two proteins, which are then put into cells in our taste buds. And these 2 form a pair, and they are the receptor for the common sugars. So if you do a molecular study, you can show that these 2 proteins, T1R2 and T1R3, as a pair, bind everything that we know is sweet, virtually everything we know that is sweet. It's complex how it does it because it binds them on different parts of the receptor, but it appears that for the consciousness of sweetness, these are the major things that do that. And interestingly enough, one part of that is paired with another receptor, T1R1, which is very similar, but sufficiently different so that it is doesn't bind sugars. But the T1R1 plus T1R3 binds glutamate and is the umami receptor. So those receptors are clearly what's involved in conscious perception of umami taste and sweet taste. Now, one of the things that's really exciting, which has happened in the past maybe 10 years, has been the realization that these receptors, which we call taste receptors, of course, because we discovered them in taste and taste cells, these receptors are found throughout the body. And again, looking back on it, it seems, of course, it's obvious. Nature would use the same receptors to detect sugars that we can perceive or amino acids that we can perceive. but it could use them in the gut, in the pancreas, throughout the body to detect those same molecules. And it turns out that's what happens. And similarly for bitter receptors, the opposite. So those bitter receptors are now discovered in the nose, and it responds to bacterial products and sets off essentially a response to try to kill the bacteria when those products are detected by the bitter receptors. There's bitter receptors in the upper airways and a variety of other places. So nature obviously makes use of these things multiple ways, and I've always speculated that had these receptors somehow been discovered in the pancreas or in the nose or in the gut, they wouldn't have been called taste receptors. They would have been called something else, whatever they would be. But we call them because that's the salient characteristic that we perceive consciously. But it may not be their major function, and so a lot of our speculations about why we have particular receptors and what they do comes from a very jaundiced view, but a reasonable one, of what we're consciously aware of rather than what's going on in the rest of our body.
Right, and this is fascinating because even in the last couple of years, the T1R2 receptor-mediated glucose sensing in the upper intestines was the idea that that sensor potentiates glucose absorption by activating regulatory pathways that help you uptake the glucose. That's really amazing when we talk about the importance of the microbiome. So the fact that not only do we have this huge DNA repository of all these organisms that really outnumber our own cells that live there, but their waste products go into our absorption organs, and they aren't just our absorption organs, they also sense. There's also, when we talked about those cruciferous vegetables, there was a long time, a really great article in, 2012-ish, 2013 in New England Journal of Medicine about the receptors that cruciferous vegetables and some of those compounds like sulforaphane activate sensors in the gut as well. And so this idea, this mind-gut connection, which goes back, and in Chinese medicine, they were using bitter melon, they were using herbs. We couldn't detect in our blood, we couldn't detect the compound, so we thought, oh, this is nothing, right? Because you're not seeing a tissue response. But this potentiating and mediating and upregulating other pathways is so critical. And you're right, if you hadn't discovered it in the taste side first, would it have ever even been crossed over to there? Who knows? Because it's just fascinating that you guys found these things. And talk a little bit about how these receptors deviate from, for example, like when you were talking about carnivores versus hummingbirds versus pandas versus other organisms. This is something that you can really go animal to animal with the genes and figure it out. This doesn't have to just be guesswork.
Yeah, well, and that's true. And you have to have some predictions, and you can look at the genes, but in the end, to be honest, you really need to take those receptors out and see what compounds bind to them. Mm-hmm. So one interesting one, which is a great puzzle, since you mentioned it too, the giant panda is a carnivore in the sense that it's in the order Carnivora, but obviously it's not a carnivore in our sense, because
it eats bamboo.
It eats bamboo. It doesn't eat meat, and so.
Where does it get its protein?
we were particularly interested in that, and it turns out that because it eats plants, as a member of the carnivore, we predicted that it would have a sweet taste, and it does. It has a perfectly. You can look at the receptor in giant pandas, and you can show that this receptor should bind sugars, as it does in humans and other animals that we know like sweet. And then when we did with our colleagues in China taste tests, giant pandas love sugar. So that doesn't explain what their diet is. And the other odd thing about this, and I really don't know what to make of it, is that the giant pandas seem to have lost their umami receptor, at least from a genetic point of view. So we're actually trying to do some tests on response to amino acids in giant pandas. Don't have any data on that yet, but it would seem to suggest that they don't have that receptor. And again, one could make hand moving arguments that perhaps it's because they have such a simple diet, a single food, that there's no real need to detect protein, because they're essentially they wouldn't have a way to go after it in any case. But that's hand waving, and again, I don't know the reason for it, but. So there's still a lot of puzzles. And I go back to another umami one, which is one that is very, to me, striking, and that is that, as we said much earlier, that this T1R1, T1R3 umami receptor, which I would call, I think, better a glutamate receptor, is very specific to humans. And if you look at the same receptor in rodents, mice in particular, which is what most people have looked at, it is not specifically aimed at glutamate like the human one is. It's aimed at many amino acids. And to me, that makes much more sense. So it almost seems as if something has happened in the human evolution pathway that has led to much more specificity in this. And then that correlated with what you brought up earlier, which has always fascinated me, the fact that the human milk is extremely high in glutamate, and this is not the case for rodents.
No, but it is high. Theirs is very high in protein, and ours isn't very high. Yeah. We've got the least amount, which is really, again, it's fascinating because it's easy to believe the beautiful story. You and I, as a scientist, when we put our science hat on, we know proving this is a much more difficult thing. But in terms of as beautiful stories go, it's really amazing at how many of these things line up.
Yeah, obviously I agree with you. The other thing that you were bringing up is which has always fascinated me, is this idea that somehow people learn, and perhaps animals as well, to consume things that maybe have health benefits but are not so particularly sensorially attractive. And the example that I've been still working on really a lot is the flavor of extra virgin olive oil. And I'll just do a real quick story on this. Basically, we had been doing studies on the drug ibuprofen, which is an anti-inflammatory drug for reasons I won't go into. But that is a really interesting sensory experience. If you take an ibuprofen, and grind it up and dissolve it in water, which nobody would do in their right mind, but actually is done for infants and children. What happens is that the taste of that is, when you first put it in your mouth, is kind of weird and not particularly pleasant, but not awful. But when you swallow,
I'm going to do this later.
When you swallow it, basically, all of a sudden, you feel this burn right where males at least have the Adam's apple in the throat, and it really stings, it really burns. So what we discovered was that ibuprofen does that, and so I think that there was some interest in trying to get rid of that because of using liquid ibuprofen for infant formulas, infant medicines. But that particular sting in that particular part of the throat was really unique in my experience. And then somewhat later, I was at a great meeting in Erice in Italy on food, and we had all these people who were interested just in food and flavor and they were physicists and chemists and nutritionists and biologists. And at that meeting, there was a guy named Harold McGee, who I'm sure you probably know. So we had to do demonstrations, and one of the demonstrations was extra virgin olive oil brought up by the organizer of the meeting. It was in Enrique, and he was at the university there and had his own olive oil things. And I did something which I'd never done before, which is to taste olive oil like it's done in Europe, which is to put it into a glass and drink it. I had the wonderful smell of it, the wonderful feel in the mouth, but it's odd putting pure fat in your mouth and swallowing it. To be frank, it was a little bit unpleasant, maybe even slightly nauseating when I first did it. But the mouthfeel was great. And then I swallowed it, and there's exactly the same burn in the throat. And so that led us to a long series of studies, which I won't go into, but basically identifying a compound in extra virgin olive oil, which is a natural anti-inflammatory, which we named oleocanthal, which is now being studied all over the world, as one of the potential reasons for the health benefits of the Mediterranean diet is the consumption of olive oil high in in this compound, and maybe some related compounds. But what to me from a dietary point of view that still is a puzzle is the consumption of this anti-inflammatory. You can think of it as sort of analogous to low-level consumption of aspirin, which protects against heart disease and many other things, perhaps. And this compound seems to work against pathways in heart disease and in neurodegenerative disease like Alzheimer's disease and so on and so forth. And so presumably the people in the Mediterranean area, they grew up with this, and for them, this burn in the throat is a signal of a really good olive oil. Now, why would that be? There's no logical reason for it, and if you give one of these olive oils to a very naive person, like myself was at the time, and have them drink it or consume it, it's not liked because it hurts. It hurts the throat. I mean, it's painful.
Right.
Nevertheless, that is the sign of the very best olive oil, and that's all the people in the Mediterranean area, I think, not all, but would make that judgment. So somehow that sensory attribute has come from maybe initial negative to a positive based on cultural history.
Right.
And I think many things like that maybe we don't understand how humans kind of come to those decisions, particularly for something where the reinforcement is so far away. I mean, you're not getting cancer is
right.
The connection to that experience would
or
be
even beyond what a reasonable life would be in a time before sanitation and infectious disease control, right?
Absolutely.
So, and this is a really good point because olive oil isn't the salient feature of a Mediterranean diet. It just turns out that in spite of what we've done today, which is pour olive oil and stuff and think that's healthy, that there may still have been olive oil as part of the makeup of calorie because there wasn't calorie everywhere else. In other words, It could have been critically important, but this compound could in fact play a role in the xenohormesis, which is another paper, really good paper that David Sinclair wrote, where just like sulforaphane, just like resveratrol, just like a lot of these things in very small quantities, an organism or a different organism, or even in this case a plant that's under a certain amount of stress, producing these stress compounds signals, hence the xenohormesis, signals that hormesis in us. And we originally discovered hormesis, if we get back to that, because of farmers that were working with poison.
Yes.
You know, they were getting healthier being exposed to poison, where everybody today is, oh my gosh, don't be around, don't touch it, isolate yourself. And yet they were actually having health benefits of this. So there are a lot of examples of this that circle back to what you're talking about. And this really gets back even, back to the beginning of the conversation with sensing sodium, sensing amino acids at these small levels. But our modern way of looking at it is we want to isolate, refine, and take things at concentrations that wouldn't be biologically possible in nature, and believe just because it has an activation that a lot of it is going to do well. And so far, our track record hasn't been very good on that. I mean, if you really look at it, at the best, we can control symptoms long enough for our body to fix the problem. We don't cure very many things outside of antibiotics, right? We don't cure things with compounds. I mean, if someone is a type 1 diabetic and we give them insulin, in some sense, we are biologically, that is a disease of deficiency, and we are making up for that. And so that's a great example. But for the most part, when we look at the expansive thing of all of the psychiatric type medicines, all the things that for depression, et cetera, it's kind of a mess. We're not really making tons of progress. I'm not saying it has no help, but yes, there is a receptor. No one says that receptor has to go to the place of burning to actually activate, but that it might have been activating on very small quantities.
Yes, and it might even be that the burning signal is induced at a level higher than the pharmacological benefit.
Right.
And again, we have to go back to what we've been saying before, that many of these things might be very useful, very healthy in younger, more resilient individuals within a society, whereas they would be more dangerous later on. But that doesn't matter, because that's not going to be selected against. It's really just not going to be to play any particular role. So it's kind of the detection of nutrients is really, really complex. And one thing that I didn't mention about sweet taste, which is again a pretty new observation, is that if we're talking about taste perception of sweetness in the mouth and in the taste buds, we think that this receptor that we were talking about, T1R2, T1R3, is the major one that consciously signals sweetness to us. But there are, on taste cells, other receptors which are responsive much more specifically to glucose, which is, of course, the major energy source for our body, and can detect glucose. And these receptors, well, this is controversial, but I think that the many people believe that these receptors do not, this particular receptor on the taste cells somehow does not signal the conscious perception of sweetness, but what it does tell the brain is there's calories here. Mm-hmm. And so one reason that people have speculated now that, say, artificial sweeteners just don't work in the way that people thought they ought to, that is to substitute for sugar, is that, sure, they can give you sweetness, so you've got that part of it, but they don't give you the signal of the part of unconscious signal that this is a energy source.
Right.
And so I think I'm accurate in saying this, that the induction and use of artificial sweeteners in beverages has been a huge boon for the industries that produce those, because in fact they're cheaper than sugar, and they can sell them as diet beverages, or at least not calorie free or reduced calorie, but that has not really reduced the consumption of the sweetener ones at all. It's just added more sales, which is again suggestive that, I mean, this is not science, but it's just suggestive that somehow the non-nutritive ones don't satisfy some of the same needs that the ones that have real nutrients in them.
Right. Are you familiar with Stephen Simpson's work on nutritional geometry?
Yes.
Okay. I mean, I found it fascinating, and one of the interesting things that even goes back to the sensing of nutrients or sensing in the world is related to that, which is these fullivorous mountain gorillas in Uganda. And what's really interesting is, these are muscular organisms. Like they're nobody wants to tangle with them, right, in terms of this whole protein thing when you were talking about the panda. But they prioritize non-protein energy. And this is what they found, and specifically, the non-protein energy intake was found to be invariant throughout the year, whereas the protein intake was determined on its availability. And what was puzzling about this is that during the fruit season, the protein goes down to what you would normally think of in terms of a kind of a low protein diet that you would have. And then during the leaf season, when they don't have all that fruit to eat, protein actually goes up to the level of a human high protein diet. Mm-hmm. And they're eating nothing but vegetation at that point. They don't even have the calorie source. And so the fact that they didn't prioritize on protein at all, that it just sort of came along with the package, whether it was fruit or whether it was just leaves. And both of these in our current marketing dietitian, what they teach dietitians in school, none of these are quote unquote protein sources in their mind.
Yes, that's right.
You know, they don't even, this is why I don't use this term, because I think it's been completely, certainly bamboo isn't a protein source, but, you know, go tangle with a panda and you'll just see how much muscle they put on, right? So this, what you're talking about and what your work is in terms of perceiving that world around us and signaling at various levels, to me it's probably one of the most interesting sciences that everyone is dependent on that nobody knows about. I don't know how you guys are keeping the secret, but it just seems like other than the people that you're working with in the food industry, that in some sense hijack, and I hate to have ulterior motives. I don't villainize any organization, but they want to make food taste good, not because they're evil people to get you addicted or any of that stuff, but because they want to sell product, and they're okay wanting to do that. But what's interesting is that it just seems like the average person, just like you were saying about the difference between the Japanese culture and a Western culture with sweet versus umami. And I interviewed Ali Bouzari on this, and I think he had one of the best quotes ever because he was talking about everybody thinking umami is Japanese. And what he said was, gravity isn't British and umami is not Japanese. Japan is just the dope studio where umami dropped its first mixtape. And so, you know, they just popularized it, right? They discovered it for exactly the reasons you're saying, but there's so much left to be done. And I really hope we can have a further conversation on this, because I still believe that there is a big component of your work that can be used in the work of dietary restriction, in this world of signaling that sort of is somewhere between what Dave and I wrote about the metabolic winter hypothesis and dietary restriction and how those come together, what Stephen Simpson's talked about with nutritional geometry, and what you're talking about with a host of animals and their sensing. Again, it's going to be hard to do more than a hypothesis paper at that point, but I think there's some really fascinating connections that could be made, because this is really a multidisciplinary subject. And one of the problems that we have is that the only place funding this for the bigger place, or the main funding source of this, is just sort of making foods taste good, and it immediately translates over into this is an antioxidant, you know, drink olive oil. I'm not saying you're saying that. I'm just saying, like, this is the kind of mindset where it goes of how can we sell more olive oil, as opposed to the more subtle part, which I think is much more difficult to tease out, but critically important in our health.
Well, of course, I agree with that completely. And an example of that kind of issue, which I've spent quite a bit of my life on, is salt. And I think the evidence is pretty strong that overconsumption of sodium is not good for you. It's obviously still controversial, but I think back into the companies that we had or have had dealings with, and Campbell Soup is a particular one because I'm in Philadelphia and it's right across the river in Camden, and of course it's one of the iconic brands in the world, and it is very, very salty. And you, in the 80s, I remember that they were, 70s or whenever, that they put out low sodium soups. And what they did is they took salt out of the soup. And the result was absolute immediate. Nobody bought it. It was, and in the end, and this is more recently, they've actually been reintroducing salt into some of their foods at a higher level. But I don't think, that Campbell Soup has any desire whatsoever to give people
hypertension,
heart disease,
right.
Hypertension. Yeah, not at all. They're trying to sell a product, and so what is important, and may have some real impact upon the real world of something that we have done at Monell, is that we were the first to demonstrate that actually you can sort of wean yourself off of high salt diets. It's not so easy. It's certainly not easy in our culture where salt is added for many reasons in many places, in many restaurants. And salt has a remarkable product for the chefs. It makes bad things good, and it has all kinds of great functional consequences. It's a great blocker of bitter tasting things. So you can add salt, and I think that's the reason actually salt is added so often to vegetables, is because it reduces some of the bitterness. But in any case, what was found was, and what we found and other people have replicated, is now part of the supposed policy of FDA and CDC, is that companies should reduce the amount of sodium they put into foods, because about 80% of what the average person eats is not of salt is not added by them. It's added by the manufacturer or the restaurant or what have you. And it does seem as if you put people go on reduced salt diets, that they can shift downwards so that they no longer find this high level of salt necessary or even particularly attractive. And so these kinds of things, this is a big question, a big nutrient question, and salt is a simple thing to go after, and I love going after simple things because the other ones are way too complex. But even here, we've got a very complicated system, and one that suggests that we go back to the very original thing I was talking about, that during evolution, there was never a worry of consuming too much salt. Salt was hard to find for an herbivorous animal. Salt was
just like
very
calories.
Exactly like calories. And so to build an organism like ourselves that has a strong and persistent desire for that sensory attribute makes perfect sense. And then for a manufacturer, a company that's making food, to add more to make the food sell better also makes perfect sense. So we've got to fight against those things and find ways to go around them.
Right. And let me add to what you just said, because in the 80s, in terms of craft food, this is another thing. This was the dawn of the low-fat phase. And so those soups that you were talking about, what they did was they were trying to get a label, percent fat, just like they do in milk. They do the same thing with fat-free, 2% fat-free, 5% fat-free, et cetera. They were trying to get a label, and so what they did was they took the exact same can and they added more water. There's still exactly the same amount of fat in that can, but what happened? When they diluted it with water, now the percent fat went down so they could get the right label that they wanted, but the flavor went down with it. So what did they do to combat the fact that the flavor went down? They added salt. And that's where the basis of them bringing that salt back, that was one of the original things. At least that's what Jeff Novick, who was working then in that, he was develop and organize material for them and was part of that at that point. He's a dietitian now. But what's really interesting is that all of that was a combination of wanting to appeal to government recommendations, but at the same time try to appeal to the palate, which we had been acquired to. And then to touch on another thing that you said on two occasions, which I absolutely agree with, is the idea that obesity is probably not causal. It may be maladaptive, but I can tell you most of the clients I work with, they come off of their medications, they have complete glucoregulatory control before the fat is gone. And in my case, I lost all my weight and it got worse. So when I had this situation, they told me to lose weight, I lost weight, my glucose control got worse. And it wasn't until I changed my diet that it got better. And so the fact that a person, and they've done this in similar studies where they do randomized bariatric surgery. One of them goes through the bariatric surgery. The other one just does the post-bariatric surgery diet. And you know what? There's no difference between the two. But interestingly, if you talk to somebody in the healthcare profession, me telling a person not to swallow so much is considered extreme, because for some reason we compare calories in and calories out on a daily basis. I know why if I go back to all these historic books on my shelf, why Atwater did it, why Rubner did it, why von Voigt did it, to understand the calorie balance and to try to construct what eventually became indirect calorimetry. But that we do it today is irrelevant, because our metabolic bank account is much closer to our bank account and writing checks. We don't write checks based on what we deposit in any single day. And if you did that, you would tend to have a surplus of money all the time. And that's exactly what we do with food. We compare nutrition in and out in a day, but clearly nutrition, just like we saw with this gorilla when we were talking about, like we saw what you were talking about with the variation of food throughout the seasons, clearly nutrition can't be a daily thing. But this idea that we want the Soylent Green, the goop that we have every single day that has everything just perfect, it really doesn't fit our social structure, and it certainly doesn't fit our biology. Getting every nutrient every day in sufficient quantities is probably a recipe for chronic overnutrition. It's just clear to me, and I see it, and then hearing what you're talking about with taste and flavor and how subtle some of these nutrient-seeking mechanisms probably are, to me just underscores that we've got to look at this problem a little bit differently.
I will agree with you. Certainly the idea that, again, looking at evolutionarily speaking, no animal uses and consumes the same amount of any nutrient on a daily basis. It's got to be on a much
bigger scale.
Much bigger scale than that. That goes without saying. The idea that and I am just sort of anecdotally more than scientifically interested in the idea of calorie restriction and longevity. I actually knew well the man who maybe, and of course I don't remember his name right now.
McKay?
No, he did mouse studies. He was a physician out in California. And one of the interesting things about him was that he was in the first...
Roy Walford.
Roy Walford.
Yeah, Roy was a very good friend of mine, too.
So
I worked with the Biosphere 2 project back in the day when I was still at NASA. I was working with Biosphere 2.
Okay, so were we. And,
how about that?
But we were working with Roy because Roy was a friend of my colleague who at that time had moved to Arizona. And so when Roy went in with that first group...
Yes, Tabor and Jane were my friends.
Oh, yeah. Many of those people seem to be a little bit nutty, but Roy was a really good guy. And I don't know if it was email or how we were communicating with him at the time. Then we had this idea that maybe in that atmosphere, there would be some changes in sense of smell. And so we actually made some test devices that we could send in to test those people's sense of smell, and Roy was going to do that. And I guess he did it. I don't think we found anything interesting. I've always rued the fact that we were trying to study smell, which didn't make much sense, but flavor and taste and food, that would have been much more interesting.
Gary, it's been great talking to you today, and I'd love for us to have some more conversations on this. I'd love to send you some papers as well about some other things, because really and truthfully, my goal was to translate what we learned beginning back with Roy Walford and some of the early stuff in dietary restriction and the more later stuff that we've learned, and combine that with the culinary side. So going back to culinary school to understand, can we put stuff on our plate? Can we develop new ways to enjoy food? And this may not be the most commercially viable way to live, but it may have a significant impact on our life. And I think that what's key to everyone is that people want their food to taste good. They want to enjoy it. And getting back to the very first example that I told you with coffee and espresso, that doesn't make sense. But clearly what we've seen over this discussion is that there are some really strong flavor elements and emotional and social elements that go into this. And what you're saying is it seems like this can be changed over time.
Right. Good. Okay, that's great. I've enjoyed this, and it's a great topic. And one of the really good things about it is it's a topic that at least is of interest and accessible to people, to wide ranges of people. Mm-hmm. Everybody eats. Everybody is interested in that, and the convincing the people at which we have to do at NIH or places like that fund research that it's worthy of research. That's a different story.
Right.
But certainly the general public is particularly interested in it. So it was good talking to you.
Thank you for being on today.
Okay, good.
I knew that would be a lot of fun. Thank you for joining me on this path to good health. It's always the food for your mind and body, so keep eating right.
Thank you for listening to Science and Saucer. For more details about the content in today's show or to contact Ray, please visit us at healthspansolution.com.
Welcome to the first day of the rest of your life. Couldn't get any better, should have been much worse. Welcome to the last road on the right of your life. Was paved with good intentions, hoping this is not all that you wrote. All that you wrote. Food is habit.